Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
To her teacher, my regards.
Welcome to the Institute. I'm John Winchowski, president of the Institute, and I am delighted and honored to have you here today, as well as our distinguished speaker. This is the inaugural lecture of the Digital Soft Power series, which is a series that is hosted through IWP's Center for Human Rights and International Affairs. This center is a joint project between the Institute of World Politics and Good of All, which is a wonderful organization that has undertaken a most unique and strategic task of fighting the war of ideas at a time that this war has to be fought. And very much the idea of this is that human rights is a positive alternative message that, that can make the forces not only of the West, but of decency throughout the world competitive, and perhaps offer a compelling alternative vision to those who might be attracted to other, much more nefarious ideologies. To introduce our speaker today, I'd like to introduce to you Piero Tozzi, who is currently counsel for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He has been there for a couple of years, and before that, he used to be a senior fellow and general counsel, as well as executive vice president at the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute, which does not only a lot of work here in Washington, but is a very active NGO at the United Nations. Piero is a graduate in History and East Asian Studies from Columbia University with his law degree from Fordham, and we're delighted to turn the podium over to you, Piero, and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, John, for introducing the introducer. A lot of introductions here. Well, I have the privilege and honor of introducing our main speaker, who is Ambassador Andrew S. Natsios. He's the co-chairman of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea and executive professor and director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at Texas A&M University. And before that, a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at our local Georgetown University. Indeed, I'm not the only one who's privileged. You are as well. Ambassador Natsios is truly one of only a handful of top experts on the current situation in North Korea. And I had the opportunity to meet Ambassador Natsios last year when he testified as a witness at our House Foreign Affairs Human Rights Subcommittee hearing on human rights abuses and crimes against humanity in North Korea. Now, I do have an opportunity to listen to a lot of witnesses testify on a variety of topics, and Ambassador Natsios' remarks were memorable not only for their clarity, but also for their substantive import as well. And it really, I think they reflected a combination of scholarly presentation as well as practical wisdom. And indeed, our speaker today draws upon a wealth of personal experience, including serving as USAID administrator from 2001 to 2006, managing reconstruction programs in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. And he also served as special envoy to Sudan from 2006 to 2007. But it is probably his first-hand experience as vice president of World Vision US, which is the largest faith-based non-governmental organization in the world, which gave him his most vivid impressions of a country that he identified at his hearing last year as, quote, the most repressive, most brutal, and most severe violator of human rights in the world today. For it was while at World Vision that Ambassador Natsios witnessed firsthand how the great North Korean famine of 1993 to 1998, which killed an estimated 2.5 million people, was exacerbated by a government policy that used the distribution of food aid to punish regions that were deemed less politically reliable less loyal to the regime, in effect punishing the civilian population with a slow, excruciating penalty of death. And I note that that estimate of 2.5 million deaths is Ambassador Natsios' own estimate, because in addition to his practical experience, he is also a scholar, perhaps the foremost authority on the topic. He's the author of the standard account of that terrible period of Korea's history, a book entitled The Great North Korean Famine. I also note that he contributed a chapter to a book called North Korea's Troubled Transition, on what a policy of food aid distribution in North Korea should look like, which I recommend to you because it's a model of clear-headed compassion. Thus, again, I just want to remind us of how privileged we are to hear from such an expert on a topic that is particularly timely given the events of the past several months, and that is the DPRK, Human Rights and Security in the Digital Age. And with that, I give you our speaker. Thank you.
That was a very nice, in fact, I'd like to always have you in
Be a pleasure.
It's more interesting to listen to you than to be listening to me. Well, let me talk about North Korea a little bit in terms of the question of human rights, and then talk about how the digital age is eroding the North Korean state. When I started work on North Korea when I was at World Vision, I was not an expert in North Korea. In fact, I knew what it was, but I didn't know much about it, and I didn't focus on it. And I read a World Food Program crop estimate in the fall of 1994. No, what is it? Yeah, 1994. My time is, yes, it's 1994. No, the fall of 1993, excuse me. And the famine started, actually, a year and a half before anyone in the outside world realized. And as we began to page through press reports from the Chinese border, and little indicators, we call them pre-famine indicators. I teach a course called Great Famines, War, and Humanitarian Assistance, and how we intervene to stop people from dying in famines. And we have a group of things, they're called pre-famine indicators. Without going through them all, because it's a 3-hour lecture, we saw them appear. And the North Koreans don't know what a pre-famine is. They never heard of it. They never read Amartya Sen's book on famine economics and all that. But we could see these, it appeared just on the border area. And so I decided to go into North Korea. And I went in the spring of 1995 with World Vision. And it was actually the peak of the famine. And we went up, we weren't allowed in the Northeast, which made me very suspicious. Why were we not allowed? It turns out that was the epicenter of the famine, where there was a huge number of people dying. In fact, there was a truck in Hamhung City, the second largest city in the country, the industrial center of the country. It was called the death truck, because at 5 o'clock every morning they would drive up and down all the streets of the city and pick up the dead bodies, because people frequently, when they were on their near death, would just walk outside to try to get help, and then they would collapse and they died in the streets, literally. Now, we couldn't interview anyone. They used their translators, not our translators. And so I know the translations were wrong, because I remember a hospital director, I said, how many malnourished children do you have in the hospital? Translated it. And the government minder, who was basically a secret police guy, who's watching me and my delegation, had a yelling match with the director of the hospital, because when he told the director what to say, the director refused to say it. And I said, well, this is very interesting. Now, we don't know what they're saying in terms of the words, but they were close to blows. So I knew in North Korea that doesn't normally happen. You don't argue with the secret police. So we realized something was happening. And I realized you couldn't see it inside the country. Why? This is my first point. In a totalitarian dictatorship, which controls everything in society, not simply politics, but everything. That's the distinction between a totalitarian dictatorship and an authoritarian dictatorship, a distinction that Jean Kirkpatrick made when she was ambassador to the United Nations under President Reagan. There is a distinction. This is not an autocratic state, it's a totalitarian state. It wants control over everything. And they were losing control. It was pretty clear on this trip they were losing control. So I decided to developed a coalition with my colleagues from the NGO community, and we organized a whole effort to get food in. But as we did that, we forced our way into the country with aid workers, and they began to send emails back about what they're seeing. And if you piece together all the emails, it creates a mosaic of what was really going on. It was very clear a famine was going on. We didn't know the intensity of it. So I made a decision after I left World Vision, retired from World Vision, I went to USAID to write a book on the famine. So I was kind of obsessed with it by this time. And I went up to the border with a Buddhist monk from South Korea, the Venerable Pamyong Sunim, who had his own NGO who was helping the North Koreans. It was underground in China. That's when I knew China was no longer, it was an authoritarian state, but not longer a totalitarian. They didn't even know we were in the country. And the whole area on the border is ethnically Korean. So Pamyong Sunim, he didn't wear his Buddhist robes up there. He wore a fisherman's hat. And he told me I was a Russian. And I said, I don't speak Russian. He said, just don't say anything. We'll just say you're a Russian businessman, you're doing business here, because they would stop us in the car. No, he's just a Russian. He's kind of stupid. Don't, you know, he doesn't know anything. Don't ask him any questions. And we went through this all over the place. And people were telling us in Washington, various people, I'm not going to go into who, told us there's no famine, you're making this up. And I'll remember one moment, we were right on the river, and we were seeing on the other side of the river, on a mountainside, a mass burial. Now, in Confucian and Buddhist theology, or Buddhist teaching, you do not ever bury someone in a mass grave, because the way in which a body is positioned after they die affects future generations in their view. In Confucianism and in Korean practice, and even though North Korea is a communist state, it's still very Buddhist and very Confucian. So we counted 28 bodies being dumped into this giant grave, and people stood at quiet attention, and then they filled in the ditch. And we saw mass graves all over the border area. So very clearly a North Korean famine was going on. And then we started interviewing. I interviewed for 3 weeks people escaping the famine. And this is my second point. The North Koreans had lost control of the narrative of what was going on in the country. Because when I interviewed people, I said, so tell me what you've learned in China. Because these were people who were in China, because I couldn't get into North Korea, and I would have been arrested. I said, what did you learn? What are you learning? He said, we were told that the South Koreans and the Chinese are starving to death, and while we're hungry, we're better off than they are. We can't find any Chinese who are hungry, let alone starving. They're all very happy and very prosperous because they have television. And I went through the rural area. I was astonished at the prosperity in these small Chinese villages. And there was no one hungry, except the North Korean refugees, who you could tell were refugees. They were disheveled. And it was very interesting. I said, well, you going to go back? And they said, well, we've made some money. We're going to take it back so that our family can survive. And I said, what are you going to tell people? They've been lying to us all these years. What we found out is that South Koreans are 10 times richer than the Chinese. And the question is, if they're 10 times richer and the Chinese are happy, why are we starving to death? Okay? So, now, you can talk to people, interview. You don't know who you're interviewing. You don't know if it's comprehensive. The Venerable Pamyong and I were so obsessed with finding out what was going on that he sent underground teams in to interview thousands of refugees. And I actually have the text of the interviews in Korean. Unfortunately, I had to have a professor of Korean at Boston University translate these remarkable documents, which talk about the utter horror of the famine, of widespread cannibalism, for example, of conditions in the household where there were lots of suicides. Whole families would commit suicide. They would take rat poison, or they hang themselves. Parents would hang their children and then hang themselves. The cannibalism was the most disturbing. I didn't put it in my book because I thought Westerners couldn't handle the notion of widespread cannibalism, which takes place often in Asian famines. In the famine in Ukraine that Stalin visited upon the Ukrainian people, that killed 12 million people in the 1930s, there was cannibalism in Ukraine. So we saw all of this, but in the Venerable Pamyong Sunim's interviews, this is not 2 people. I interviewed 30 people, 40 people. He interviewed thousands of people with his huge staff, and it was the same questionnaire, the same questions. And what was very clear is people believed the government was lying to them. And we asked them, well, what are people thinking? They're blaming the government for the famine. The North Koreans were blaming the Americans for the blockade and the South Koreans. They're the responsible for the famine. 2% said the United States and South Korea were. And we sent food in with the American flag on it, the USAID symbol on it. And of course, this caused even more furor because the bags that we used to transport the grain were used to make clothes and dresses, and they didn't throw anything away. Okay? These are burlap bags, a lot of them. And so they still have this stuff on. The North Koreans had to have a propaganda answer for why there were 8 million bags running around the country as dresses and clothes, and they're being used for other purposes. This is reparations for the damage the United States did during the Korean War. That's why you see all these bags. But people didn't believe it. People did not believe it. What was most interesting is the Northeast region was being triaged. They prevented any food aid from getting in and any commercial supplies from getting into the three northeastern provinces. And there was a WFP shipment coming in from the United States, from Food for Peace from the IB, and it had the American flag. And the North Koreans said, you cannot land the boat. This is the first shipment of food coming into an area at the epicenter of the famine. And they said, for 3 days, you can't land unless you take the American flag down. We cannot tolerate it. But everybody could see the food shipments in the harbor. So eventually, after 3 days with the flag waving, they took it down. And I asked people, I said, so what'd you think? He said, everybody knew the Americans are saving us, our government's starving us. We're wondering now who our enemies are. Very interesting observation. Now, there was no electronic media at that time. 10 years later, profound change. 20 years later, profound changes. The Economist is reporting this now. There are news reports coming from the border area. There are now about 1 million cell phones in North Korea, believe it or not. But there are cell phones made so that the government controls and can monitor what's going on. These are only given to the Communist Party and the secret police and the elites. However, because there's so much trade with China, people can't tell one cell phone from another, so they're spreading. And guess who they're calling? Relatives in South Korea. They're calling people in China, even though it's a capital crime to do. Doesn't make any difference, they're doing it anyway. They're finding how to text message. They're doing all these things using electronic media, and guess what they're finding out? That the South Koreans are extraordinarily prosperous, the 13th largest economy in the world. Now, this is the most fascinating thing. The thing that's done the most damage to the North Korean government are soap operas from South Korea. They're extremely popular. And there's no propaganda. They're not done by the South Korean CIA. They're done to make money. They're like our soap operas. Except they're done in a typical apartment or house in South Korea, who have televisions and radios and dishwashers and refrigerators, none of which the North Koreans have unless you're in the upper elite of the party. The damage is not from the romances and infidelities of these soap operas. It is, they're simply watching. They're also watching the size of the South Koreans. Because the South Koreans on average are about 9 to 10 inches higher, taller than the North Koreans are, because of chronic acute malnutrition over several decades. So there's we've got some declassified information that the average North Korean soldier is 9 inches shorter than the average South Korean soldier. Now it's the same race, so it's not a racial change. It means chronic acute malnutrition that causes stunting. But what is having the damage is to show these people in the soap operas through, and it's illegal to watch them, but they're all over the place. Apparently everybody watches them. So electronic media now is having an enormous corrosive effect on the propaganda of the North Korean regime, which no longer works. They make fun of it, as they did in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union collapsed. Propaganda in Russia in the 1980s, no one believed it. It was a joke. People would make fun of it. But that was not the case in North Korea when I went. When I went, people actually believed that there were other causes of this. It was only as the famine got more severe, people began to say, how come they're letting us die And they were told South Korea's poorer than China and everybody's starving and the rest of the world, we're the ones prosperous, which is obviously fictional. So the media is having an effect on social control, which is just simply no longer working. And we know now that the cell phone technology is picking up. The DVDs are, and this enormous amount of trade across the border with China, even though they're bringing it, electronic media in for entertainment purposes, they're also getting news now about the outside world. Nothing is more damaging than the truth. And a free press and an open media can have a profound effect in these countries. It takes time, though. Americans are very impatient. They want everything done immediately. It doesn't happen overnight. But the North Korean regime is not going to last forever. In my view, its days are numbered. It's a question of whether it's next year or the year after. There is evidence of infighting within the regime. The fact that Kim Jong-un apparently executed his own uncle, who was the regent, who was, by the way, insisted on by the Chinese. The Chinese insisted that his uncle be appointed as the regent because the son was so young and inexperienced, and he was. The North Koreans were actually threatened by the Chinese, apparently. The Chinese told us that, which is very, very unusual for that to happen. And the Chinese now, increasingly, the North Koreans are turning to Russia for help because they no longer trust the Chinese, because the Chinese now, there's evidence in the news media, even official party organs in China are now saying the North Koreans are going to drive us into a conflict with South Korea and Japan and the United States. Why are we protecting this lunatic regime that runs around threatening nuclear war with everyone, is building nuclear weapons, which is destabilizing the whole region, with people that are unstable? The leadership is unstable. It's clear to many of us who analyze this that Kim Jong-un does not have the level of control Kim Il-sung does in a personal sense. He does not have the cadres, even though the purges have been going on, not to shoot everyone in the old leadership, but to retire them. And there's a lot of resentment and anger over it, but he is not in control of the government to the same degree his father and grandfather were. And as that happens, you're gradually seeing an slow erosion of the base, and a lot of that has to do with information. And what I thought I would do is just add another use of technology in the human rights area from my time as Sudan. I wrote a book, The History of Sudan, that came out 2 years ago. And I was envoy, but I spent 25 years working on Sudan. And when the atrocity started in Darfur, which began really in August of 2003, in early 2004, Roger Winter, used to be the president of the U.S. Committee on Refugees, who was the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance under President Bush, he came into my office and I said, we need to do something to measure how bad things are getting in Darfur. Because we heard these reports of villages being burned down by the Janjaweed, which is basically a government militia, armed by the government and funded by the government. They're committing horrendous atrocities. There are mass rapes going on. They would go into villages and shoot all the young men, dump them down the well, and then rape all the women. So we spent AID money to hire a private satellite company to photograph Darfur each day and then compare the villages one day to the next. And you can see the village with people in it and animals, and then the next week, same village, clearly from the patterns, it's the same village, all burned down, no people, no trees, no animals, and no village, no houses, the roofs are all burned off. The roofs are made of straw. And President Bush and Colin Powell told me to take the photographs to the United Nations Perm 5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, of which we were one, of course. The Chinese and the Russian delegations completely dismissed the photo. They're not clear enough. So I went back and I said, we need to get U.S. satellites, spy satellites, NSA, to photograph, because their photography is much better than the commercial photography. The president usually takes 2 years to declassify these photos, and we would have to redirect the satellites, because they weren't focusing on this. Within 2 weeks, President Bush had sent an order out immediately, do it. It's not widely known. I put it down in one book, but it's not widely known. And we redirected the spy satellite, or the president did, And I got the photographs. There's absolutely no dispute of what was going on. Very clear. And we counted 2,800 villages that had burned down. And then a year later, we kept doing the photographs. It was up to 3,800 villages. 1.7 million people were displaced by this. So it was the use of satellite technology and information that allowed us to conclude beyond any doubt at all that there was a massive ethnic cleansing campaign with huge numbers of casualties. The estimates now are about 300,000 people died directly or indirectly as a result of this ethnic purge going on. So technology can have a very powerful, now I became envoy. We talked to Google, and Google Maps took all the photographs and put them in the Google system. So anybody in the world can see the photographs. Now I took the photographs to a meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where the Sudanese sent 20 people, and there were 38 countries that were donors that were pledging to try to deal with the displacement and the starvation deaths that were going on from the displacement. And I remember taking it's a high point. You remember high points when you're in office. And I had the photographs all blown up on easels. And I pointed to the Sudanese delegation and I said, we're watching everything you do. And you are going to pay price for the atrocities you are committing. And I said, you see these photographs? And they were stunned. And some of them didn't say anything. They didn't know what to say. I said, here are the photographs right here. You can see 1 week to the next week. And it had a very powerful effect on the meeting and on the Sudanese. They were scared. They were scared. So technology is reversing. The final story I'll tell is the use of cell phone technology in the Egyptian Revolution. I don't know if you all knew. Cell phones were a central part of the revolution, the uprising in Egypt. Guess who introduced cell phone technology into Egypt? USAID. The business community complained to us bitterly that they had to leave the country to make a long-distance phone call. It was affecting commerce. The phone system was so bad, it was all landlines. So we had Gamal Mubarak, the son of President Mubarak, see him, because we couldn't convince the president. He was wise, actually, to say no. But his sons convinced him to liberalize, at least in terms of cell phones. And I think Gamal may have made some money, I don't know, I can't say on this whole deal. But Egypt was revolutionized, and we brought in an Egyptian American who went to the University of Pittsburgh, PhD in cell phone tech, and he became the Minister of Telecommunications. AID helped write the law for competitive bidding. We helped write the law in terms of information, the internet, and the use of cell phones and the whole regulatory structure that goes along with it. And now they're all over the place. And that is, now it was 10 years later, but one of the instruments that allowed the demonstrators to communicate with each other were these cell phones. Now, cell phones can be used, and I say this, technology is neutral. It's morally neutral. Bad people can use it, and good people can use it. Hitler used the radio for very bad purposes. We use radio, I'd like to think, for good purposes, to have public debates, freedom of press, freedom of information. What was very interesting is during the Arab uprising, there was no successful uprising in Sudan. The secret police, I know them well, I fought with them, I've been threatened by them, the NIS, National Intelligence Service. And when the uprising did start in Sudan, the secret police sent text messages. We're going to begin a demonstration in this area. All of you who want an overthrow of the government, report immediately. Students. Hundreds of students came to these different sites. It was the NIS that was sending the text out, and they had surrounded the area with secret police, heavily armed, and they arrested all these students, and they disappeared into the prison system. We've never seen them again. So they used the text system against us, against the uprising that would have taken place. And they were successful. I don't know how long it will last, but they were successful. Anyway, those are my comments. If any of you want to ask me questions or just sit here and have a conversation, I'm happy to do that. Any? Yes?
Well, yeah. My name is Ryan Kelly, and I'm an intern here at the Institute of World Politics. Something I noted that you mentioned that the regime isn't going to be around forever. So, you know, what I've studied the past couple of years is democratic transition theory, you know, the literature strictly. And like I'm looking over some of these different theories and I'm wondering which one you think is most realistic. You know, if you look at two authors, Higley and Berg, talk about elites being unified and that can break down regime and ultimately the country can transition to a democratic state. You know, you have other authors like Haggard and Kaufman that talk about crisis versus non-crisis transitions, where it's the economic context that shapes the transition to a democracy. And then one of my personal favorites is Dankworth Rustow, who talks about national identity. If you have people who can consensually unify under some type of cause, you can have democratic transition that follows. So I'm wondering, of these three, which one do you think is the most realistic?
In the North Korea context.
In the North Korean
Yes,
context,
because
right?
the problem with the academic structures, these theories, is
Right.
none of them are generally applicable almost in any area. People try to take hard science and say, well, there must be some general theory of relativity for social sciences. Well, they're not. And culture affects, region affects, history affects the context. Okay? North Korea, in my view, well, one, given my philosophic worldview, and Edmund Burke is one of my favorite philosophers, using the existing institutions, however dysfunctional, gradually reforming them is always the best way, even in a dictatorship. It's much better than revolution, no matter what it is, frequently ends up in chaos and anarchy, and we usually have a Thermidorian reaction against the chaos, and we have a dictatorship come back, which is exactly what happened in Egypt. Okay? What happened after the French Revolution? The Bonapartes came back again. Napoleon came back, and then his nephews came back later as emperors. So the best way, but that, of course, that's not what usually happens. Now, what leads to these transitions is this. In the case of North Korea, in my view, it's going to be economics that will do it. There is clearly a division among the elites, and we're now discovering the reason that Han Son-taek was executed by his nephew, Kim Jong-un, is because he was the secret leader of this, on the Politburo. He was on the Politburo, the Central Committee. He was the leader of the reformers. People say it's a monolithic state. That's just not true. There are no states monolithic. There are states like Nazi Germany where Hitler made the decisions, but there was fighting among Hitler's subordinates. That doesn't mean we can be successful in influencing these factions, but you have to be aware if the infighting gets intensive enough that the elites split. Okay? I'll tell you what I think is happening in North Korea. Their economic model simply does not work. And there is chronic acute malnutrition among 20 to 30% of the population. And we know from a lot of empirical research that's been done by public health officers over decades, more than decades, that caloric intake that's severely constrained over 20 or 30 years will do permanent damage to the analytical ability of children when they grow up, and they can't be repaired. If you do it, if it happens for 2 or 3 years, it can be repaired. But for 20 years, the damage is enormous. And it affects their cognitive ability, and the data is very clear, very clear. So we have already 2 generations of North Koreans who are having severe intellectual consequences for at least 1/3 of the population, if not more than that. And I met some of these people. I have to say it was very disturbing to see the effect on their inability you ask them questions, and just the physical condition was just appalling. This is in the countryside in China when I interviewed them for my book. Now, what the Chinese have done is they've been trying to convince the North Koreans to do what Deng Xiaoping did in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And Deng Xiaoping had a famous conversation with the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean state. You need to allow the outside world in and bring capital in and bring technology in because you're going to be left behind. And Kim Il-sung's comment was, if you open the windows, the flies will come in. And Deng Xiaoping's response was, you should put screens up, keep the flies up. The flies are freedom. The flies are information and technology and knowledge, okay? Well, the Chinese have not been successful in doing that themselves. They're trying, but they're not successful, and you all, I'm sure you've seen the studies of what's happening inside China in terms of the younger generation. So what is happening is this: the Chinese have fed up with the North Koreans ignoring their advice, and they're doing basically what was done to China. And without going into the great detail, the development of Hong Kong as an independent state, a British colony, in terms of their economic miracle in the 60s and 70s, led to massive sucking of labor from the neighboring Chinese provinces into Hong Kong for the factories. They didn't have enough workers. And they were paid well. They went back, they bought televisions and refrigerators. And so party officials went in the late 1970s to those provinces around Hong Kong, and they said, how come everybody's heavy here? And we had a terrible famine. 45 million people died, and these people are all prospering. They've got refrigerators. No one has refrigerators in the rural areas in China. And they started asking around, and what was the answer? They're all working in Hong Kong. So they tried an experiment. They said, let's do the same thing Hong Kong's doing in one of the other provinces far away, see if it works. It worked. They decided to spread it. That's how it spread. So what the Chinese are doing now is they have a massive economic development program. Billions of dollars are being spent on infrastructure and industrialization in the Chinese provinces neighboring North Korea, on the other side of the Tumen River. And what is happening is the Chinese have basically colonized the North Korean state in terms of its economy. Almost all of the exports go to China. 95% of all the exports go to China, and all the imports come from China. What is the currency used now in the markets? They use dollars, and they use the Chinese currency. The North Korean currency is useless and worthless. I can tell you why in a minute if you ask me, but they don't use it anymore. So they're using the Chinese currency and our currency, which is even more odd. And all our exports and imports with China. China controls the economy. China controls monetary policy, savings policy. That is one of the reasons that, and I'm told the North Koreans are getting very nervous that they're becoming basically a vassal state of China, and that is that one of the reasons they are attempting to counterbalance that with Russia. Okay? That is not terribly successful because the Russians don't have a lot of money right now. And so that is why we're beginning to see South Korea and North Korea begin to have some conversation. This park has initiated some announcements of dialogue. I think it's because they're so desperate economically, and they're afraid the Chinese are basically going to completely take over the economy, that they are beginning to get scared, and enough that it may change their political dynamics inside the country.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Paul. I'm a student here at IWP. I also served in the military. I was on deployment on alert in '92 in Korea, and was actually in China in '85. So we have a lot of stuff that was in the same level.
Yes, yes.
I also know General Dunn and Dean Bellucci at Georgetown.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. So
Yep.
we talked a lot about 1994 Sunshine Plan and stuff. My question, well, I have like a two-part question. One is. So I hear you saying that the North Korean regime, the support of it is corroding because of the diffusion of these kinds of technologies that allow or minimize the transaction costs of trying information. Right? They have a cell phone, they can see that it's not what their leaders say the world is. It's not the world at the door and all that. So, I mean, my first question is the instability in transition. It's kind of similar to what the previous student had asked. I would contend North Korea's regime's decline has to be managed. I mean, what's to stop, say, North Korea from inciting or infecting other state actors in the region with instability? Because the current regime, knowing it's going to be out on its behind, and I'm pretty sure if that happens, they're done. So they go, well, they have nothing left to lose. Let's start a war anywhere. We'll sit there and put the pressure.
If this were Russia and Eastern Europe, they border a whole bunch of countries, that could happen. Who does North Korea border on with? Borders with South Korea, the DMZ is they're not going to destabilize South Korea. They've tried for 40 years, they've been unsuccessful.
Could use no-dome ballistic missiles against
Well, that's
Japan.
different. That's a war.
That's what I'm
But in
saying.
terms of destabilizing neighboring countries, they're not going to destabilize China, and Russia has a small border, they're not going to destabilize. I don't see the risk of a guerrilla warfare propaganda working. The reason they're developing nuclear weapons is precisely because they feel that's the one lever they have left that they could use for intimidation purposes.
Right, I'm just saying maybe they view it as an all-or-nothing gambit and they actually use it.
Well, but the risk is these people, there's only one objective of the North Korean state, and it's very clear, it's survival.
Right.
A nuclear exchange is not survival, it's complete destruction of North Korea. As Condi Rice publicly said once, if North Korea tries something, they will become a parking lot very quickly.
Well, okay, I'm just saying how they might frame it. And
Well, no, they might, but you know, the North Koreans have given the impression that they're irrational. They're not irrational. They play us, and we think they're irrational. That's why we're scared of them. I was on Texas TV when Kim Jong-il, when he was still alive. No, it was when Kim Jong-un's, one of his generals, was threatening the United States, and they actually said they're going to bomb Austin or Houston. Now they're rival cities, so one city doesn't care, and they care a lot, you know. So they put me on television. They said, "Can they reach us?" And I said, "No, right now they cannot reach us. One, and two, they're not going to reach us." Okay? How many missiles do you think they have? Hundreds of missiles? They have one or two, and the missiles they have had, the missiles, half of them break up after takeoff. So is there a risk? Of course there's a risk, and if this continues, there could be a larger risk. But in terms of nuclear blackmail with the United States, it's just not going to happen because of our arsenals and our size and our distance. The risk is with South Korea and Japan, our allies, to try to neutralize them. I don't think that's going to happen either. I think this is a desperate gambit by a failing regime. I don't see it working. They clearly, I mean, if you saw the astonishing website they took pictures of American cities, we think from Godzilla or one of these B-class movies from the 1950s, and they had superimposed nuclear bombs exploding on this pictures. It didn't say which cities they were, but it was New York City, and you know, and they had nuclear bombs, and they had this on their website. This was the threat that they were going to bomb American cities, and this was supposed to intimidate all of us. You know, and I think one of the reasons they're doing this is less to try to destabilize the neighborhood. I don't think this is not going to happen. I think it's a way of uniting the elite. Go back to this question of these theories of conflict and stabilization, democratic transition. Is I think the elite was separating into factions that were quite aggressive with each other.
Right.
How do you, in a dictatorship, create a unified elite? You create an external threat that is seen as an existential threat to the country, and that's supposed to unite everybody. I don't think it worked. That didn't work either.
And so the second kind of add-on to that was, what safeguards should we adopt to stop maybe unintended negative secondary consequences that define this case as the inclusion of the free market to bolster regime survival? I mean, you mentioned China. China set up special economic zones to sit there with the goal of exacerbating technical diffusion from the core of the periphery and targeted key strategic sectors that the Chinese theorized would, had maximum amounts of crossover between civilian and military research. It wasn't because they loved capitalism or the West. They adopted a more efficient system. That doesn't mean they let go of their hostility. They just tried to find a more efficient way to support said hostility. So what safeguards should we use to maybe insulate against?
Well, my view, and there's a Russian scholar who teaches in Seoul. He's one of the leading experts, and he has advocated opening up. That is to say, the more North Koreans see the world, even the elite, the more it's going to change perceptions of the outside world. One, when the North Koreans say, you think about us all the time, I said, well, I'm sorry, but we don't think about you all. We don't think about you at all. You're irrelevant. What is there in North Korea that we need or want? Nothing. By the way, the same thing happened in Sudan. At one point, the Sudanese newspapers were saying, the Americans have discovered water underneath Darfur, which is true. In northern Darfur, it's called the Great Nubian Aquifer. And the reason the Americans are putting pressure on us on human rights atrocities in Darfur is because they want to steal our water. And I started laughing at one of the newspapers in Khartoum, and I said, And what are we going to do with the water? Have you been to the United States? It's not a desert, I mean, except for a few parts in the West. I said, we have more water than we need. This was 10 years ago. And I said, the notion, and it's so cheap, why would we're going to pipe it from Darfur all the way to the United States? So there are these conspiracy theories. And the way to deal with it is just to laugh at them and just say how preposterous they are. The more information gets in, the more the debates there, people, I think, see the reality. So I think they're going to negotiate a gradual change. Now, whether that will work or not, it's a different matter. The North Koreans are not the Chinese. They're not the Chinese. And they don't have, I can see no figure, except Hwang Chun-tep, who's the one who was executed, being a Deng Xiaoping, who accepted the need for change in China, mainly because he had suffered himself and because of the catastrophic effect of Mao's policies that caused the Great Leap Famine that killed, we now believe, there's some Chinese estimates that 45 million people died. It's the worst famine in recorded history between 1958 and 1962. And there's a lot of evidence that one of the things that caused the transition to a market economy before Deng Xiaoping started in the mid-1970s. There's evidence now, some provincial governors with the highest mortality rates from the famine adopted these reforms before the central government allowed them. Why? They were interviewed by some scholars. We're not going to let this happen again to us. Do you have any idea how horrible the famine is? It's a horrific thing, horrific thing. And so the North Korean famine of the mid-90s, the consequences of which still continue, I think had an effect on the entire culture and society that we only vaguely understand. Because I've seen this in other countries.
Two questions. So, one, when a society goes through 2 generations of this famine, what does that do to those generations' intellectual capabilities? I mean, is your ruling class or people with the horsepower then even diminished even further?
No, the elites have not been badly affected. In 1958, Kim Il-sung gave a speech in which he divided the society, and he actually gave percentages. There's 3 groups of people in North Korean society. There are the disloyal class, which is, I don't remember the percentages exactly, but it was something like 22% of the population were disloyal, identified as people who were hostile to the communist state. They came from landowners' family, they were from religious families, Buddhist or Christian families in the north, they were business people, they're capital, whatever, landowners, and they were the hostile class. Then there was the loyal class, which is around 25% of the population. The rest are suspect, or mixed loyalties. They're in the middle, okay? Now, the evidence is that they actually determined rations to people during the famine, even now, based on their loyalty to the system. And the rations were higher the more important you were to the regime. So if you're a member of the secret police, you got 10 times the ration as the military did, as the military did. And if you were a member of the Communist Party elite, you got more than the secret police did. And if you're the Kim family, you got chefs from France brought in to cook for you. So the higher you were in rank and in loyalty to the party and to the regime and to the elite, the more food you got. And so who's dying off? People who are hostile to the regime. They starve people to death basically in the prison system. We know from a huge amount of research that's been done that the ration is you cannot survive on the ration in one of the prison camps. It's below maintenance. Yes, sir.
That question, so to completely buy your premise that access and greater access to information and the evidence of improving economies to the north and south is going to work. But so when you were interviewing folks along the border in China in the mid-90s, how long at that point in time did you think that the regime in North Korea would be able to remain in power?
Well,
did you really think it would take another, we'd be 20 years
no,
today?
I did. And Nick Eberstadt is a good friend of mine at the American Enterprise, wrote a book about the coming demise of North Korea. And he got into a big fight with Marcus Nolan, both of whom sit on the board of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea that I co-chair with Roberta Cohen. They had a big fight in Foreign Affairs. They both wrote articles and books. And Marcus turned out to be right over the short term. Well, 20 years is short term by Chinese, North Korean standards. By American standards, it's a huge amount of time.
Yes.
But Nick said they're on their last legs, about to fall. Marcus said no, they will survive because it's a very famous quote. I interviewed someone who was a defector from the senior leadership. Hwang Jong-yap was the president of Kim Il-sung University, which is the, I don't want to compare it to Harvard. I'm not making any comments about Harvard, but it's the elite school of North Korea, okay? He was the third ranking member of the Politburo. He was the tutor of Kim Jong-il, okay? And he invented Juji philosophy, which is the philosophy of the North Korean state to this day. Hwang Jong-yap in January of 1995 defected to South Korea. And there's a big debate. Marcus Nolan thinks that my estimates of 2.5 million people. It's not my estimate, okay? He keeps saying this, Natsios is exaggerated. He said that 800,000 people may have died. No, that's nonsense. How do we know? Because Hwang Jong-yap wrote a book in Chinese, or Korean. I had it translated, the section, the first chapter, second chapter. And he says in it, I went to the director of the Statistics Bureau and asked him in November, December of 1994, how many people died. And he said in 1993, 500,000 people starved to death. In 1994, 1 million people starved to death. And in 1995, 2 million will starve to death unless we get some relief. Okay? Now, he then defected the next month. I think he thought the country was going to collapse. And there were coup attempts. There was a coup attempt that I have identified. South Korean intelligence has confirmed it, and 2 other scholars have confirmed there was a coup attempt in the city. Remember I mentioned this industrial city with very high, it was in that, the core headquarters was in that region, okay? That was the epicenter. In fact, some refugees told me 40% of that city died of starvation, 40%. And so the officers saw people starving, and what did they do? They organized a coup. And I talked to a defector who actually watched the 23 officers get taken out in chains, and they were taken out and shot immediately. And they disbanded the entire corps as a result of this coup attempt. So there have been military attempts, and I think the risk is not of a popular uprising. The risk in North Korea is a military coup, and someone even crazier than could take over than who's in power now. That's the bigger risk. By the way, don't assume, as many people do, that a coup will bring Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or George Washington to power. I don't think so.
Andrew, I'm going to have to leave a little early,
I
but I just
understand.
wanted to thank you so much. And I also was delighted to hear you talk about the North Korean theme that tries to impart their irrationality. It just so happens, having been a student of Soviet disinformation and strategic deception, that one of their classic strategic deception themes was, we are paranoid, and therefore you have to handle us with kid gloves.
Yes.
We're not just rationally fearful, we're crazy fearful. And so therefore you've got to treat us with kid gloves and sign arms control agreements with us and all that kind of stuff. So this is all the same thing.
It is the
I
same
got it
thing.
from the same playbook.
Absolutely.
And I thank you very much for
Thank you.
a wonderful presentation, and please don't let me stop this.
Could I answer your question?
Yes, sir, thank you. Al Gombas from the State Department. In the media recently, there's been talk of putting North Korea back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And so I've been debating with some colleagues this idea. It seems to me, I'd like to get your take on this, but it seems to me that it's really not in the cards, even if it was a good idea, which I'm not convinced it is. In part because I believe it's been less than 10 years since they were on the list, and there haven't been any confirmed incidents with North Korea being involved in something that would be considered terrorism.
there's a lot of talk about them being behind, for example, the Sony hack. But
I haven't talked about that.
But there's a lot of speculation that maybe the FBI is not quite as convinced of who the culprit is as the initial statements were, and so that's tentative. Their involvement with plane hijackings, with kidnapping of foreigners. There's no confirmed incidents that I'm aware of in the last 10 years, and so if they were to be redesignated now, considering that the designation, that they were taken off the designation less than 10 years ago, it would look very political as opposed to substantive. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, we're about to release a study on the question of whether they should be put back, and I do not want to comment on the subject since I haven't read the final report yet. I was supposed to read it last night, and I was too tired. And Greg Scarlett, who's our executive, said, Andrew, you have to read it because I got to release it. So until I read it, I don't want to make any comments on the specific question, because I may be contradicting what's going to be in the report, and I don't want to do that. Yes.
David Roush, Center for Human Rights and International Affairs. Do you think that you were talking about how they're shrinking, the North Koreans are legitimately shrinking? Do you think that when the regime collapses, do you see that continuing, like it's now part of their genetic makeup, or do you think that?
Oh no, my grandfather was 5'2". Okay, and he immigrated from Greece in 1905, and he was a herder and a farmer, a tenant farmer, very poor, illiterate. He worked in the mills here for 50 years. All of his sons went to college. My father was 6'2". Okay. So the question is, was my grandfather 5'2" because he lived in the Ottoman Empire? He never lived in liberated Greece. So was he 5'2" because of a genetic problem? If that's the case, why are all his sons 6 feet tall? He had 5 sons and 1 daughter.
The fact that his wife was 6'6" is irrelevant.
No, she was short too. Okay? And I'm 6 feet, even though I'm shrinking now as I get older. Okay, but I think he was seriously malnourished. Now, it did not appear, at least for my grandfather, to have affected his analytical ability. He would get his news from television. He would have these very animated debates with my father about politics and all that. And he was a highly intelligent man, even though he could not read or write. Intellect has nothing to do with education. They're highly educated people who don't have any intellect at all, and they're the opposite too. I'm a professor too, so I'm not denigrating education. And you can be a person a very smart person who doesn't have an education still be smart. So it didn't. I don't know in his case. I could never quite understand because we never did a study of the family genes and all that. It's just I know how big all my uncles were, and so is there permanent damage? It's clearly for at least a third of the population there's damage. Now, does it affect your genetic makeup? No. If you have children, because if it did, the South Koreans wouldn't be as big as they are. If you look at the South Koreans in the 1950s, they're short. Because they had one of the highest acute malnutrition rates in the world in the 1950s. South Korea was really very poor. Very poor. Massive amounts of AID food, huge amounts from Food for Peace went to South Korea for 20 years. And I've had South Koreans tell me when they were children the only food they ate was Food for Peace food from AID. Now you never know it now. You walk down the streets in Seoul, they're not short. So I have just a story that I had when I went to a conference in Seoul to deliver a paper. We have a group of interns helping us in South Korea, and this young student was a graduate student, and he was working and he was my guide during this thing, and he went to government agencies with me and helped me. And he's 6'2", South Korean, and he's an officer in the reserves, lieutenant. And I said, so what do you do for your spare time? He said, well, I tutor North Korean defectors and refugees. And I said, so how big are they? He said, oh, they're all about a foot shorter than me. And the thing that upsets them, they ask me constantly, he said, will we grow to be big like you? if we eat more now? And they're all grown up, so the answer is no. But they ask, are our children going to be short like us? And the answer is no, they're not. Genetically, if they're fed properly, the children will, and the children will not have the genetic damage or the biological damage in terms of their intellect. It's not passed on genetically, as I understand it. Yes, sir.
I think you said, sir, that there would possibly be a gradual economic.
No, I said it's possible.
Possible,
It's
okay.
possible. I hope that's what happens.
So they're sort of leaning toward Russia, and they're highly influenced economically by China, and they have an affinity with South Korea, so.
Well, they don't have an affinity yet, okay? What's happened in the last few months is I'm seeing, now, all of my Korea Watcher friends, very skeptical, and this is not really happening. I think it is happening because I think we're getting some indication the North Koreans realize that by not ending the conflict with the South, stopping these threats, and trying to move toward economic reform, they are basically being colonized by the Chinese. And they're scared, because they see China as a bigger threat. And that's why the rhetoric coming out of Beijing is very hostile to North Korea now, from official channels. And you'll see in the party newspaper, the principal elite college of China for the senior leadership of the Communist Party, they have a newspaper. And the deputy editor wrote an op-ed piece saying, why are we putting our country at risk to a conflict with the United States that will be catastrophic for both our countries, for this country, North Korea. Now we're seeing the same thing appear, and the North Koreans are now issuing public statements attacking the Chinese. You don't see that normally. So there's clearly something going on here, and now you're seeing a warming up of relations with North Korea and South Korea. Now, where this is going to go, I'm skeptical, I have to say, and Miss Park's mother was assassinated. I don't know if you know this. She is the daughter of President Park, who created and was a dictator, but he created the economic miracle that is now South Korea. By the way, AID had 8,000 officers. 8,000 officers for 20 years, 8 officers in South Korea working on the development. And I was going over this with some career people today, and they said, if you look at the evaluations at the end, they said this country is never going to develop. 20 years of this work is just a waste of time. Why did we do all this? It's very critical evaluation. There is such a thing called a time lag in development. It takes a while for it to sink in. Well, it's sunk in. Pardon me?
It took a generation.
Yeah, it did take a generation, and it's a changed place now. But anyway, what was your question
I was
again?
just wondering which way they might.
I think they're going to make an attempt to either make an alliance with Russia or with South Korea. It may be temporary, because their ultimate objective always is the survival of the elite. That's what it is. Yes.
It's also temporary for the time being because North Korea is outsourcing labor camps
They certainly are.
in Russia. So, I mean, for now, there's definitely some kind of connection economically.
And guess who collects the salaries of all of the workers who work in Russia and China and other places? The North Korean government. Those workers don't get that.
Right, they're paid maybe pennies. Right?
Yes, tiny amounts. Tiny amounts. Okay, I think that's it, is it?
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much.